Well, first of all, greetings to all of you here with us in person, and also to those of you who are joining us online. My name is Marcus Carson. I'm a senior fellow at the Stockholm Environment Institute, associate professor of sociology. And the Stockholm Environment Institute's mission is to bridge science with policy with practice. You'll hear more about the other organizations represented here on the panel as well. And we are co-leads for the Sustainable Lifestyles and Education program under the One Planet Network. When the program got underway almost a decade ago, it was already quite clear that the aspirational and demand side drivers of consumption were important. But I don't think we fully realized at the time what an enormous impact that household level consumption has on driving this triple crisis with climate change, biodiversity loss, and waste. What we did know at the time, or I'm quite sure we understood, was that there are huge disparities in which some people aren't consuming enough to meet their needs, and others are consuming not only more than their needs, but I believe with the previous session that focused a lot on lifestyles. I think there's perhaps a little bit of overlap that's beneficial, because we need to keep thinking hard about how do we shift these lifestyles activities, and some that are very complementary. So we're looking forward to building on that. That also tells us that there's some real synergies that we can tap into and increase the impact that these programs have going forward. We run from now until around 6 o'clock. We have a hard deadline at 6. We also want to invite those of you in the audience to share your observations and questions with us using the chat function. We, in all likelihood, will have time to get to a couple of these questions toward the middle or end of the discussion. And in any case, we will record those so that they become a part of the feedback that we have to work with going forward. And we'll do our best to respond to some of those questions and then post them later on. So we'll have that. And let me make sure I covered all of the points in my list here. So with that, I'd like to welcome our colleague Atsushi Watabe, who's the director of the Sustainable Consumption Program at the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies. And Atsushi, if you could also say a word or two about what IGES does, so that people also have a sense of our various organizations' efforts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcus, and good afternoon or good morning, everyone. I'm Atsushi Watabe from the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies, Japan. And our institute, called IGES, usually works with the national or local governments to promote their climate mitigation or adaptation, biodiversity conservation, and sustainable consumption and production at the local scale and national scale, as well as regional scale in Asia-Pacific region. But for this Sustainable Lifestyles and Education program, we have been coordinating the program together with the SCI, and particularly we put energy on supporting the community level actions or school level actions or some city level actions to promote sustainable living based on their differing needs of the local context. And their recent results are summarized in this report. And for the participants of this physical meetings, please bring the hard copies of this report in English, Spanish, and Japanese if you are able to read them. But today, I would like to spend time, 10 minutes, introducing the highlights of the recent IPCC Working Group 3 report, Chapter 5 on the demand, services, and social aspects of climate mitigation.
Just a sec. We just need the slides up on here. Yes, perfect. Oh, it'll happen when he clicks. Perfect. Yes, there they are.
There we are.
Yep.
Okay, perfect.
So,
thank you.
Thank you. So this is the latest IPCC report released in April. And for the first time in the IPCC report, it has the chapter on demand side mitigation, covering the lifestyle changes and behavioral changes.
Atsushi, if you click one more time, because it's the slide on the left that's being shown. Yes,
All
go
right.
ahead.
I misunderstood. Well, and there's some of the highlights, including that their demand-side mitigation, including lifestyle changes, will potentially achieve their 40 to 70% of greenhouse gas mitigation. And this can be aligned with their efforts to improve well-being for all. And we have three main strategies to enable the demand-side mitigation, which are avoid, shift, and improve. But lastly, it's quite important to note that socio-cultural, technological, and infrastructure changes are needed to enable this demand-side mitigation. So, let me introduce some of the sentences from the report. For example, the demand-side mitigation includes the changes in infrastructure used and thank you, end-use technology adoption and social, cultural, and behavioral changes. This can reduce the global GHG emissions in end-use sectors by 40 to 70% by 2050. And these are consistent with improving basic well-being for all. So this is a diagram showing the potential of greenhouse gas mitigation in different sectors, service sectors, related to our basic living, like nutrition, housing, transportation, and so on. And the blue bars show that their mitigation potential coming from their social cultural aspects, while the red bars are from the technological changes, and the yellow bars are from the infrastructure changes. So these mitigation potential differ from one sector to another, but for all sectors, we need to combine all of the efforts of socio-cultural changes and technological changes and infrastructure changes. And the other important point from this chapter is that demand-side mitigation should be and can be aligned with the achievement of decent living for all population globally. Because even now, 1/3 of the global population are in the status of energy poverty. So actually, we need to improve the energy demand, energy provision for these people. But the question is how we can achieve both climate mitigation and provision of more energy for basic services for people in their status of energy poverty, meaning that some of them are lacking of energy for basic services like cooking or washing or healthcare and so on. But, there are a few hints for achieving their both objectives of climate mitigation and achievement of well-being or decent living. The first hint comes from their comparison between countries or societies in terms of equality and their greenhouse gas emissions per capita. So if we compare the countries or societies in the same income levels, equal societies can achieve higher level of well-being compared to unequal societies among the developed countries or among the middle income or lower income countries. Because in the more equal societies, public services with higher quality are provided, and so higher level of or fairer participation are achieved. So these factors can facilitate the implementation of their effective climate mitigation. And another important point is that with fairer trust among people based on their fairer participation to the decision-making process or implementation process, including their women and marginalized populations. These are effective in promoting and disseminating the pro-environment behavior, as well as introducing some of their costly policies for climate mitigation, including their energy shift. So this is apart from the IPCC report, but let me introduce one case from the project we have supported in Colombia. In the rural Colombia, we have collaborated with the villages and community organizations to introduce appropriate technologies to improve the livelihoods of the farmers, such as the bioenergy use or less resource-intensive crop farming and livestock farming. But during the implementation period, COVID-19 pandemic hit the area. So they couldn't continue some of their face-to-face activities. So they had to shift to the online learning and online collaboration to continue their activities, supported by the younger population. So due to the pandemic, their project now became their platform for intergenerational collaboration and mutual learning to improve their village economy and village livelihoods. And after that, more than 100 communities in Latin American regions are interested in replicating the same model to provide sustainably grown foods to the society, a wider society of Latin American regions. So in a nutshell, if we can integrate some of their essences like fairer participation, empowerment of the marginalized populations, and equal income generation and distribution opportunities, we can promote climate mitigation with a broader participation of people effectively. So this is the first essential point learned from the IPCC report. But the next question will be how we can practically promote demand-side mitigation. And to this, let me take one example of mitigating the greenhouse gas driving from their commuting to your workplace by automobile. So there are three strategies. First one being avoid your traffic by introducing teleworking. And the second strategy can be shifting to the public transportation or bicycling for your workplace. And the third one can be the improvement of efficiency by introducing electric vehicles. And these three strategies of avoid, shift, and improve can be introduced to all potential sectors like housing, heating, healthcare, nutrition, and so on. I don't have time to dig into detail of these strategies now, but what is important here is all of these strategies need the collaboration or integrated approaches of technological shift, socio-cultural shift, and infrastructure shift. So these are not just the matters of behavioral changes. So indeed, the IPCC reports emphasizes that we need to integrate the behavioral drivers, socio-cultural drivers, and business drivers, and institutional drivers, as well as technology and infrastructure drivers to promote the climate mitigation. So for example, for the behavioral drivers, we can tap into their awareness or their concerns or of the population, or we can also introduce some of the measures like their improvement of accessibility or improvement of their choice architecture. We can also tap into some of their socio-cultural factors like their shared meanings or their shared narratives about climate changes. We can also boost some of the collective actions. We can also think of how business can contribute to the climate mitigation in the demand side, like their business commitment to zero carbon or investment into the new services or products or investment into alternative technologies. But to facilitate these efforts, we need the institutional changes or institutional arrangements to promote the cross-cutting collaboration among societies, among business sectors, and governments, and so on. So finally, if we have these arrangements, we can also expect their improvement in the technological side or infrastructures will be further facilitating the changes in the individual or societal or business sectors. So the key takeaways for this session from the report will be that demand-side mitigation is about changing of the way we provide basic services to the societies through the socio-cultural, technological, and infrastructural changes. So even though about half of the global greenhouse gases comes from or attributed to the consumption of the wealthier 10% of populations, we shouldn't just target these 10% of populations. We should aim for the holistic changes in the society or in our economy through the efforts of all actors like individuals, societies or communities, businesses, educators, and policymakers, and so on. So, well, these are some of the points I learned from the report, and I would like to continue the discussion with the panelists today.
Very good. Thank you, Atsushi. Round of applause. So we're going to have a little bit more space on the panel because we're missing a couple of people. I don't want to use that up too early in the process. But let me just point out a couple of things that see if I've understood correctly what you're describing. One is you're talking about actually increasing consumption in low-income countries. And that seems, I think, could easily seem counterintuitive. Could you speak to that just really briefly, a couple of lines? What are we trying to do there?
Well, well, some of the projects we collaborated or some of the projects introduced in the previous session showed that it's quite important to provide the basic energies for the communities level or household level to improve their well-being as well as improve their livelihoods and enabling sustainable and reliable means of living in particularly for the marginalized or population or the people in their vulnerable economic conditions. And to this end, we can do so by more cleaner technologies, reliable technologies in the cheaper prices. And and in this way, we can avoid that the increase of energy consumption will lead to the further increasement of the greenhouse gas emissions.
Great, great. So what you're saying is that they don't have to make the same mistakes that we've made.
Exactly.
Follow the same pathway. Great. Thank you very much.
I just want to note, I'm not sure if my microphone, yes. Patrick Schroeder is here, and Manisha Nantharaman and Patrick wrote a great paper on this called Lifestyle Leapfrogging, where they basically made that exact point that, first of all, we can learn a lot from communities and their alternative ways of living, and also, as you say, we can leapfrog to another way of living, and I think that's what we're definitely wanting to do. So just wanted to make that note.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Now is the point I want to introduce you, Vanessa.
Great.
And then I'm going to spontaneously toss you a question that would have gone to Kate.
Great.
Because you've spoken about this some. But our co-moderator is Vanessa Timmer. She's executive director of One Earth. I'll ask you in just a second to say a few words about One Earth. But as you do that, so much of what we talk about when we talk about shifting consumption is about doing less, about taking away things. And that feels, it feels like we're being asked to restrict ourselves. And we may well have to do that. But there's another part about the consumption that we know from work like that's contributed to the World Happiness Report that says that the kind of consumption that we engage in the global north doesn't make people as happy, at least long term, doesn't make people as happy. And since so much of the change process that you've been involved with neighborhood, sort of community-based change involves the kinds of things that we know produce satisfaction and happiness. I wonder if you could both introduce One Earth, but also say something about your local project before we go into the rest of the group.
Yeah, thank you, Marcus. Yeah, that's such a passion of mine. I think so much of the environmental movement has been about what we're reducing, and that's a critical conversation because we're not going to be within our ecological means without looking at those high emission areas that we need to change. And how do we paint a picture of better living within that? And also look at most people on the planet live one planet lives today. So what are these, those who need more in order to live good lives? Absolutely. And there's a lot of people living ways of living they'd like to continue. And so how do we get inspired by those alternative ways of living? So One Earth is a nonprofit think and do tank. We're based out of Canada, and we work globally on creating and imagining sustainable ways of living. And as Sushi was saying, we do work across all of these different aspects. So we work with policymakers, with businesses, with communities, with funders and philanthropists, with artists, with educators, to imagine and create these kind of sustainable ways of living. And we do that through working with Atsushi and others on the Sustainable Lifestyles and Education program as part of the One Planet Network. And I work with Atsushi as co-lead of the working group on amplifying sustainable lifestyles with that work. And we also work alongside a number of other collaborators. For example, we partner with the C40 cities to look at how local governments can enable sustainable ways of living. And with groups, because when we connect with people just as individuals, we feel kind of lonely in doing this work. But big change happens when we do things together in neighborhoods, in workplaces, in sports clubs, in communities of interest. And that's a big part of the work we do as well, is across those different communities. So it is my pleasure, as Marcus was saying. So I think this better living piece that you're just asking about, we know that also, in addition to understanding those parameters, like what's the ecological means we're living within, what is the well-being we want everyone to have? So that's our kind of parameters. And then within that, how do we dream beautiful lives, happy, healthy, decent, connected lives? And in one way, I think a lot of it is going to be more of what matters, right? A lot of what matters in our lives is going to become even more important. How do we support that? So that's a big part of what we do. And as I was mentioning in the earlier session, that means looking beyond consuming to our whole lives, including the non-market parts of our lives, our leisure, our trust, our relationships, those kinds of things. So it's my pleasure now, Marcus, if it's all right with you, to introduce some of our panelists and to have a bit of a conversation with them. And the first panelist I'll connect with is Lena Yuli, who's the head of sustainability at IKEA. And so, Lena, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about IKEA and the idea of sustainable living. How do you come at that, this movement and this work?
Yeah, I mean, we have been working for a very long time since our conception to make a better everyday for the many people and a better everyday life at home, really. And you can't really have, I think, a better everyday life at home if it's not a more sustainable home and if you don't integrate sustainable living in it. And so, therefore, we want sustainable living for our consumers and our customers to be affordable, be inspiring, and really be desirable. And that is what we're working from. So if you look at the research that we see that people actually want to live a more sustainable life, but they do not always know how and what they should do. And there is a conception that it is quite expensive and maybe not for them. So that is some of the things we are working on, because we want our products, our solutions, our offers, our services to be for the many and to really be affordable. So if you look at sustainability in the broader sense, of course, we're working really hard with all of the products that we have. They need to be sourced, in a good way. We look into the materials to see what kind of climate impact do they have. We work on the design of them to make sure they're as efficient in production as possible. All of these things we want to really embed into all of our products, so that you feel very much a trust when you come there as a customer and you want to buy something from IKEA. That should be the baseline, so to speak. But then we also work with specific focus areas for our customers where we know they have a need and that they want to get help. And that is in air, water, food, it's in energy, which also was mentioned here, and waste. So in those areas, we try to dig even deeper to make specific solutions where we can enable then our customers to live a more sustainable life at home.
Well, this is the thing. I think it's what Atsushi was mentioning as well, and Marcus too. It's about that enabling the supportive conditions for people to live their life. Because I think often we think sustainable lifestyles, sustainable consumption, we think about individual choice, and there is a part of it is choice. But if you don't have something available, if it's not affordable, and it's definitely if it's not desirable, it doesn't feel like something you'd want. Could you give me an example, say from food, about something a customer might, or somebody wanting to live a sustainable life might want, and that IKEA, for example, provided a enabling for sustainable living?
Yeah. Many people might not know, but we are actually one of the largest food providers globally. IKEA and our restaurants are getting over 600 million actually visitors that eat our food. So there we have a really great opportunity to serve healthy and nutritious food that is also good for the planet. So we are working on making sure, our ambition is that 50% of the main meals, for example, that we are serving will be plant-based. That is one of the ambitions we have. And then we are now introducing more and more plant-based foods, of course. And one of my favorite is actually the plant ball, because we have an iconic product in the meatball that we have sold and that is loved by many of our customers. And now we're giving it a real good run for its money by introducing the plant ball, where the ingredients actually are about 4%, have the 4% of the climate footprint of our meatball. Then it's about making that affordable and making them super delicious and great looking. So everybody wants to eat them instead of moralizing, but we're hoping putting them next to each other, they are fantastic. You have to try them.
Oh,
I really like them. And that is one of the ways that we work around food. And food is so close to people's hearts. So then that becomes really important. And then, of course, we inspire them even more through then their hearts and their stomachs, through going into the kitchen area where we then giving them advice on how can you live a more sustainable life in the kitchen. Everything from how do you take care of your leftovers, how can you preserve food, how do you make sure, such a simple thing as how do you make sure that you have a good overview in your kitchen of the food you already have there, so you're not buying more because you don't know what you have, to the taps that we provide, which are always having regulators, so it's got efficiency in water, so we're not spending too much water. And by then showing these solutions and really inspiring people, we're also hoping that we can change how the behavior, which Jussi talked about before.
Yeah, that sounds great. Marcus, I saw you put your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted
to jump in here.
To jump in because what you're describing sounds. I stopped eating meat 40 some years ago, and lived in Texas initially, in Austin. And I can tell you that being a non-meat eater in Texas was a real challenge. It's much easier here in Sweden, and the fact that there are easy options at places like IKEA to even experiment with that, not just to be determined that I'm going to find something that doesn't have meat in it, makes it so much easier for us to steer ourselves toward options that are, for me, it was cheaper. There were health benefits, and it was pretty gross what was being fed to animals in the U.S. So I had a number of reasons to sort of steer away from it, but to make it easy to shift over to those things and to test and see what works. That's so important in this whole picture.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks for that. And, I was thinking also about, just speaking of Texas, it has one of these great campaigns called Don't Mess with Texas, which is all about not wasting or littering in Texas. And it's really focused on adapting those kinds of communication into a local context, like don't mess with Texas. So I loved when, Lena, when you were speaking earlier about the design, everything being circular. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about how you're experimenting on that kind of circular solutions, circular services aspect, and what do you need, for example, from policymakers in order to make that, and even from people themselves, in order to make that functional and make that happen?
I mean, IKEA, like all companies and all of us, need to transform into a circular business. So what we've done so far, of course, is to make sure to design all our products with our design principles, circular design principles, so that we can be ready for scaling up all of the services that we have. So we're looking now at different services that we're exploring and trying out, everything from spare parts, which we heard about in the last session, being really accessible for customers, but also buyback services such as, can you bring your furniture back? We have spare parts, we have furniture parts. We're looking at what parts where sooner. Can we offer them in some way, in an easy way?
So that's that whole culture of repair.
Repair services, where you can actually see, can we sell secondhand, which is also, of course, then a very affordable solution for a lot of customers. So that we're also looking at, and now we are testing and trying all these things to see which ones can we scale, and which ones do we need to partner with local either governments or smaller companies to do, if it's repair services, for example.
Well, and especially if you're doing assembly and disassembly, how do you get those reverse logistics happening?
Yep.
How do you get common standards so that you can bring those shared, reused, repaired, common definitions of what that might mean? Yeah, those things are all needed to be in place in order for the circular services to work. I know you've experimented also in even renting out furniture, and so that's So one last thought from you in terms of what's possible with sustainable living before we move on to Sitra.
What's possible?
Yeah, what do you think is possible? Because you were saying it's also about inspiring, about desirable.
I think it is, and I think we see this space moving quite quickly with customers. And if we look at younger generations, there's no doubt about it. That's what they want to do. So I think when we speak about being competitive, there's a lot of discussions about cost and such. I think if you want to be in this, if you want to be a retailer in the future, this is the space you should go into, and this is the space that's going to flourish.
Great, thanks so much. Wonderful. So I also have here Dushant Monchandia from Sitra. Dushant, you've been a leader also at Sitra with the Finnish Innovation Fund, looking at this area of sustainable everyday living, and actually over the last 3.5, 4 years, creating this inspiring campaign that's inspired One Earth in Canada and our work globally. Could you just speak a little bit about that campaign, about that initiative, and how you're connected to sustainable living?
Yes, thank you, Vanessa. Firstly, my name is Dushant Monchandia, and I am a specialist in sustainable everyday life at the Finnish Innovation Fund, Sitra. And getting more to your question, so our team was started in 2016, and the purpose or the mandate that was given to us was quite simple. How can we inspire and aspire Finnish citizens to be more sustainable? Because I think, as it was talked about over here, that sustainability is associated with more negative things. What should you give up? What should you not do? Which of course means that people don't want to do more sustainable actions. And that was a huge roadblock. So when we started our work, we tried to first start with the science part. So understanding what role can citizens play and do their actions actually mean something, which is also very important to understand. And then combining it with behavior science. So combining these two very different kind of sciences into figuring out what role can people play. So coming back to you, so since 2016, we have done roughly 60 experiments in Finland with various stakeholders, such as businesses, policymakers, local civil society organizations, hobby groups, such as scouts organizations, basketball associations. We actually did something with ice hockey club also, which was a very fun activity. And of course, individual citizens. And with the best of that knowledge, we've tried to create some sort of methods which can help us engage with citizens better. And that's been our journey, at least for the last 5 years.
Great, I love that engaging all those actors, just like Atsushi was mentioning, you get those feedback loops. As more bold policy happens, bold market solutions, more behaviors become possible, people get more excited about it, there's more social mandate for more, big changes. Yeah, and I think that's the way that I've really admired what CETA has been doing, is that kind of feedback loop of trying to tackle this from a systems perspective. So you were saying this is quite at the scale. Could you mention a little bit about how many people you reached in Finland, and some of the changes, the behavior changes that you were measuring, and what kind of impact that could have on the Finnish government reaching its Paris targets, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. So I will sort of take a longer route into how we got to those methods in the first place. So when we started our work, we interviewed basically specialists from housing and transportation and traveling and different aspects of our lifestyle, which is, of course, based on the work done by IGS and other organizations. So the idea was to learn that what action can people actually do. And we ended up with we asked for a laundry list, actually, and we ended up with 100 of them. And so our challenge became, okay, that how do we get people to see a list of 100 actions which they can do? Because normally when you see a list, it's like a 5-action thing which everyone can do, but we ended up with 100 for some reason. So we ended up developing sort of a questionnaire. It's called the lifestyle test. It's available on our website. And for now, it's only focusing on Finland. It's just roughly 26 questions which help people understand the impact of their lifestyle. We try to minimize carbon as less as possible, because that's something which is very intangible to people. And I think it was also mentioned in the previous session that carbon dioxide is not something that people understand quite much. So we wanted to take the lifestyle test approach. So we have got at least 1.5 million citizens to do the lifestyle test in Finland, and for context, it's a country of 5.5 million people. So we consider it to be some sort of a moderate success for the work that we've done. But continuing on this, what happens is that when someone gives the test, it also gives you very targeted suggestions based on the 100 actions. So something that your lifestyle can resonate with, because the idea is that not everyone has the same emissions and basically in the same area. Some people probably are already living in a very insulated and proper energy house, but probably they're eating more meat. So the idea was to give people suggestions which they can resonate with also, which further led us to realize that not all people are the same. So in my ideal world, everyone would be a climate activist, but unfortunately, or rather fortunately, it is not my ideal world. So people have different problems, they have different priorities, and they have different things they care about. Many people care about having a better health. They want to have safer communities. They want to have stronger social connections. They want to be able to do the things they want to do. So with this, we came up with the idea of motivation profiles. So it was basically to understand what drives people's lives and how can we use those motivations to target them towards sustainability, because people should be able to do the things that motivate them, because the idea is still to create well-being, but it is to create within the space that we have, or the space safe that we have.
This motivations work is very inspiring, and so inspiring we picked it up in Canada and redid the motivation study within the context of the province of British Columbia. We're now speaking about taking it across the country. And as you say, what I found really interesting is that the number of people doing sustainable living actions is actually much bigger than we think. It's, people have many motivations to do, repairing isn't just because people are inspired by the climate or about the environment, but it's also because their parents and their grandparents repaired, so it's a tradition, or because they don't want to be wasteful, or because it's kind of cool, the repair cafes, it's like a social thing, or they might do it because they want to be independent and repair their own things. And these different values, depending on what part of their life it is, could change as well. But we have found it to be very inspiring because it informs policy and informs what kind of market solutions, business solutions we can produce. And it also informs our story. How do we talk about sustainable living in ways that are inspiring? And what kind of cultural norms are we bringing forward forward and sharing. So the motivation study has been a real help in beyond Finland. So maybe as a last question for you, Dushani, you could speak a little bit, Dushant, about Shift 1.5 network, which of course we're involved with as well, Win Earth.
Yeah, thank you, Vanessa. And we are actually very thankful to you for taking the motivation profiles into Canada, because it was not only you who learned more about Canadians, it was also us who learned more about motivation profiles and how we can continue improving it, which also gets me to the idea of Shift 1.5. So as we went out and gave presentations at multiple places, and for some reason people thought that the work we're doing is really cool. So they started reaching out to us that, hey, how can we do this in our local context? So we sat down together in our team and we thought, what can we do? So we basically sort of created this method book. It's sort of like a doing sustainability for dummies kind of thing, where we sort of lay out how you can replicate each of the things that we've done, but the key is to localize them. And that's what we're trying to do with the Shift 1.0 community, that we're trying to reach organizations who are very embedded in the local context of a place, because that's very important. Us sitting in Finland do not understand what's socially or culturally relevant in, let's say, Canada or Japan or Sweden or Zimbabwe, or there are so many nationalities represented alone on this panel. So we personally don't understand that. But an organization like One Earth, which was so nicely embedded in the local and cultural context of Canada, you understand it much better. So what we thought was that we can support you in doing the methods and sort of create a local peer learning community, so that different organizations, they replicate the things they do, they localize them, contextualize them according to what suits them and what suits the people in their context. And of course, the change rises, because what that does is that it also helps the policymakers become a bit more braver as more people continue to take up these actions. But then it also creates more incentives for businesses to continuing to do more. And that's what we are trying to do with the Shift 1.0 community, to sort of get this peer learning community where organizations would work with each other and help each other also, and also help us, because we don't think we've created the perfect methods. There's a lot of scope for us to learn, and that is only possible when we can collaborate and work in a peer learning sort of way together.
Thanks, Dushant. Back to you, Marco.
Thank you. I'd like to just pick up on a couple of points, and I'm going to risk infringing on what we've asked Göran to provide for us with the expertise that he has from the project he leads. But there are a couple of things I hear there that I really don't want to have disappear. One is that you're kind of starting where people are at. You work with them where they're at, rather than where they could be if the world were different, which seems really important. I heard you describe the kind of collaboration with Vanessa's organization, that we work together with others who have similar interests, but some mix of expertise, really important. And then the point about, I think that's such a challenge with this, that the contribution to these crises is so incremental, because we're all doing it, right? That it's hard to get a handle on it, because you can't point to a few ozone sources or a few pollution sources pumping into the river anymore. It's all of us doing what we do every day. And that's part of what makes it a challenge, but then to see how our shift in action actually does make a contribution is crucial. Because that feedback, I mean, I get up in the morning and check my Apple phone to see how well I've slept, right? I don't need the phone to tell me how well I've slept, but it's a bit of information that sort of keeps my attention focused on it. And with that note, let me move over to Göran Finn Veden, who I'm trying to do my good Swedish pronunciation. Göran's a professor at the Royal Institute of Technology and leads a large-scale project called Mistra Sustainable Consumption. And Göran's main mission here today is to pluck the gems out of the discussion, but there are also a lot of gems in the Mistra project that we wanted to make sure you had a chance to share some of those. So over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, a few words about the project, Mistra Sustainable Consumption. It's a fairly large project. It goes 4 + 4 years, and we are now into the second half. So we have almost 4 years, more years to go. The name of it is From Niche to Mainstream, and the idea is to look at more sustainable consumption practices that are niche practices today, and how can they be scaled up to become mainstream practices, and also vice versa. How can current unsustainable mainstream practices become niche practices in the future? And it's we are approximately 20 partners in the program. There are 5 universities involved, Swedish universities, but also a number of companies, including IKEA, I'm glad to say. Here also the idea is to have smaller niche-based companies and then the big mainstream companies. We also have governmental agencies, municipalities, civil society organizations involved as well. And if I may say some things about our results so far, it's a mixture of different things. I think actually today we published on our website a report summarizing 62 different enablers that we have looked into the program, enablers for more sustainable consumption. And it's not just, many of them are policy instruments, but not all of them. And we chose to call them enablers because many of the things that governments could enforce could actually businesses or municipalities pick up on a voluntary basis and work with if they want to work on that. Another result is that we looked into some of these more sustainable practices and see what is the potential here if we did these changes, looking into food, holiday travels, and furniture, home furniture. We could see that by making more sustainable choices in these 3 areas, we could more or less today reduce emissions by almost 40%. And that's significant, I think, because often we talk about technological changes, we need to implement new infrastructures, which is true, but we can also make changes today. We talk about practices, and that's a key word for us because to make sure that it's not about individual behaviors, really. It's about having consumption in a context where things like infrastructure matters, what are the material stuff that we have, what are the knowledge included, and that brings us to education, and what are the norms, the social norms involved. Being a non-meat eater in Texas is an example of that, I guess.
You sure you're okay with that, boy?
Some of the projects that we're doing currently in phase 2 now is looking at experiments. So it's very nice hearing about experiments in Finland. We're inspired by that. Experiments working with businesses, retailers, how can they change their things in their shops, and individuals, and also some policy experiments. We'll work with municipalities. We'll look at acceptance of different policies, working with creating policy packages to create more public support. Looking at the role of knowledge, looking at the role of myths, and also some looking into macro perspectives because we tend to focus a lot on micro perspectives on consumptions, but the macroeconomic aspects of sustainable consumptions as well. So these are some things about the ongoing research program.
Excellent, thank you. And that tees up really nicely because I want to jump ahead to you, Natalie. Just because I don't want you to be the last one who's actually sitting here to speak, we have 2 other people patiently waiting online that we'll come to, but especially since Johan mentioned the finance element. So let me introduce you properly, Natalie Mangondo. Natalie's works in Zimbabwe right now also with South Africa, and is a youth fellow for UN Climate Change. And first and foremost, I want you, if you could start just telling us what is that? What do you do? And then I'd like to ask you a little more about the finance, since that's your specialty area.
Yeah, absolutely. So I work for the United Nations High-Level Climate Champions. So you might know about the Conference of the Parties, which is mandated by the UNFCCC to drive ambitious climate action for states. So the Marrakesh Partnership then mandated the climate champions to drive ambitious climate action among non-state actors. So we work with everyone else, basically. So civil society, businesses, cities, etc. And so I work as a finance youth fellow. And what I do in the Climate Champions team is I structure transformative finance initiatives to emerging markets and developing economies, particularly those that might not be so attractive to private sector capital. So maybe it's because, the projects are too small or too immature, etc. I work to, convene, converge, and catalyze them so that we can scale them up at this pace and scale that's needed to meet the challenges that we have ahead and to secure a future for a climate vulnerable country like my own, Zimbabwe, and for young people like myself.
Great,
Yeah.
thanks. But it's less clear to me where finance comes into consumption. Mm-hmm. Can you help make that connection?
I think, if we talk about how we can impact the finance sector, it's in the way that we consume, it's in the way that we save, and it's in the way that we invest. It gives signals to financial institutions as to what they should be investing in, what they should be lending to, and what they should be insuring. So Atsushi mentioned, I think it was avoid, shift, and something else, and improve, So if we decrease emissions by investing in low carbon technologies, we can increase energy efficiency, If we change our diets like you did in Texas to less carbon intensive ones, it also gives signals to financial markets. But, I don't want to put the burden on the consumer by itself. Financial institutions also need to set and report credible targets towards net zero, and also not just towards net zero, but also in investing in carbon removal technologies as well as recovering forests and other nature-based solutions. So I think it works hand in hand, and we spoke about feedback loops, but the high-level champion likes to talk about an ambition loop. What we do gives a signal to financial markets, it gives a signal to governments as to what's profitable, as to what's not profitable, which then creates an environment for them to be able to invest even more so in those things.
That makes it much more clear. And what I hear you saying is that finance is not carbon neutral in and of itself. It has to be steered.
Absolutely not.
Marcus, just on that, One Earth works with Van City, which is a cooperative bank in Canada, and the one thing that they do, this whole global banking on values, encouraging us to move our money into places that align with our values, and they provide for example, incentives for people's sustainable living desires, so co-housing loans or housing retrofit for energy efficiency, so there's all sorts of kind of ways, and I think one of the most promising strategies we can take around making big changes in people's daily lives is in those moments where people's lives are changing already, like when they become a parent or retire or move to a new place or immigrate, and that's where finance often is at the first one at the gate, as well as IKEA is often there as well. There's a lot of organizations and efforts that we can do, and communities are there to support when people move through big phases. So I think finance has a big role to play at that moment as well, to support sustainable living choices at those key moments.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I think, You know, we don't have to make these big changes. We've spoken about countries such as my own, where we aren't at that level of consumption yet. So we should just move on to that path rather than having to transition away from that path, you know. So I'm happy that that was mentioned by you at Sushi.
Great. I think back over to you and our
Yeah.
virtual
Great.
participants.
Yes, and
Thank
thank you so much. So you were speaking also about, you know, Marcus, you were speaking about this as well. You know, this is both the lifestyles and education program, the critical aspects of education that Atsushi brought into the conversation as well in terms of building the capacity for sustainable living, for sustainable choices. So we're very lucky to be joined by two people virtually. And one of the reasons we also wanted to make sure Denise and Vimblendu were heard is that you can see that in different contexts, different sustainable living means different things in different places, and there's this great opportunity, as Duchamp was saying, to learn from each other. So Denise, I'd like to start with you. Denise Consoleero is one of the leads at Acatu in Brazil on sustainable lifestyles. I'm going to see if she's coming up on the screen for me here. Denise, let me know if you can hear me as well.
Yeah, I can.
And we can see her.
Yes, I can, and thanks for joining us there in your morning. So, Denise, could you tell us a little bit about Acatu itself and its role in sustainable lifestyles and education? Just give us a bit of an overview of the way that you've been leading on this issue.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much, guys, for inviting me to take part of this roundtable. My name is Denise. I work at the Brazilian NGO called Acatu Institute. Acatu has been working with educational and communication projects aiming at promoting conscious consumption, or sustainable consumption. It's almost the same thing. And sustainable lifestyles amongst Brazilians all over the country for around 20 years now. We have focused on last years, we have focused on activities on our educational program called Educatu, which work with education for sustainable lifestyles at formal education level. So we work with schools and teachers and students, children and adolescents mostly, in this process of education for sustainable lifestyles. We have reached around 70,000 people all over the country. This program is it's based on an internet learning platform, so it has also a technology factor working for us. But it approaches most of the things related to household consumption you guys were talking about earlier. So we focus on waste, water, food, energy, and other household consumptions that are basic in the lives of students and teachers, and we try to help them get a different approach to it. We also participate in the SLE program for several years now, so all of our expertise and all of this work with education has been the base of some insights that I'd like to share with you. I think schools are a very important hub for change, especially when we're talking about youth and children, because everyone thinks directly about the next generation and we're helping build the next generation, but this is also very clear that the change we're promoting happens right now. Children and adolescents influence their household consumption, daily decisions. So they take everything they learn in this process through these educational projects to their house, to their families, to their communities. So this is a very important hub, a very important strategy to work in education, especially for kids, for children and adolescents, in order to help to incentivize them to foster this habit change, this behavior change we are so much talking, we wish and we're talking so much about in the early speeches.
Yeah, thanks, Denise. I mean, I think that's so interesting. It gets back to what Jordan was just saying about practices and how they spread through social norms. So as you say, children and youth experience it. They might practice it even within a school context and then bring that home. It has a huge influence on them. And actually, one of the programs you mentioned Educatu. There's also cycles that you just have been involved with, children and youth in cities, lifestyles, evaluation, and sustainability. And you're part of the education working group as part of the Sustainable Lifestyles and Education program. We have Victoria Thorson here, who's also a main lead in that. She's here in the room. Hi, Victoria. Hi, Denise. So I just, you talk about lifestyles evaluation and sustainability. From your work on the education working group and from your projects like this one and the Global Search for Sustainable Schools, Denise, what are some of the things you're learning about the how of how you bring sustainable living into schools and how it might spread beyond into the community?
Yeah, we know there are some common elements. Of course, when we're talking about education for sustainable lifestyles, for instance, you gotta consider that this is a multi-dimensional process. So there's a multiplicity of factors and questions and issues related to it. But you can let it make it something very complex. You gotta try to simplify it and to present it to your audience, to students, teachers, and to the communities in a simpler way in order to amplify its reach. So it's a very important insight that we had working with this educational projects that I think it's something that we're going to take to all of our projects, both in Akatu and in the education group, working group. It's also important to highlight that the idea of learning in practice, of practice and learning, is very important in this process. So we've got to combine learning methodologies with practice methodologies in order to make this habit change, behavior change effective. So this is education, but it's education with this practice aspect of practice approach, focused on actually taking everything that people share and learn in their classes, in their schools, in their educational institutions, to their houses, to their communities, to share it with other people in order to make this change effective and continuous, because it's not, we've got to make this habit change, this behavior change has to be something that these kids, these teachers, these community leaders take to their lives.
Yeah, that's great. So simplify it so it's accessible and kind of resonates with people, and then do it in practice. And finally, Denise, if you could speak, I know that you've just collaborated with IGES on a program around future lifestyles. Also, Vimlendu is part of it. There's a lot of different organizations that have been working on that. If you're looking at the work you've been doing with Akatu, what do you see is happening with lifestyles? What do you see emerging around future lifestyles, or ones that are even here today already?
I think the whole idea is you gotta make it more accessible and more affordable. Speaking from a more vulnerable country perspective, we as Akatu have been noticing that the major challenge to be beaten in order to promote lifestyles, more sustainable lifestyles as mainstreaming it, is the fact that most of the times to take or to choose the more sustainable choice is a little bit pricier at first. So in countries such as Brazil and probably in India, you have this finance factor or this cost factor as a very important one. We've done several investigations and discovered that the population really believes that the more sustainable choices are most expensive, and if they were cheaper, if they were costed the same as the non-sustainable choices, they probably try the sustainable choices. So this is a question when talking about more vulnerable populations. This is a very important issue that we gotta try to figure out how to crack this puzzle, so how to beat this challenge and this difficulty that we've been trying to do for a few years now.
Yeah, thank you, Denise. And just gets back to what Lena was also mentioning around the affordability and to make that desirable as well. Wonderful. And now, Vim, thanks so much. Vimlendu Jha is the head and the leader and the creator of Swechha, and is also one of the key media people in Delhi around environmental issues, and has created Swechha with the hope of also engaging with young people on these issues around the environment in really powerful ways. So, Vim, can you hear me? Vimlendu Jha, are you there? Wonderful, and thanks for being there in the evening. Could you speak a little bit, Vim, about Swechha and how that's connected to sustainable lifestyle, sustainable living?
Sure, yeah, I'm the last speaker, I'm a virtual speaker. I have the advantage of all that. I mean, what a coincidence that all of us together once again. So Swechha's work, of course, in the last two decades, 2.5 decades, we've been working on issues of environment, but issues of environment from a perspective of access, resources, of course, education plays a very, very important role, but education is also very, very different when we talk about sustainability. In the sense, the luxury of sustainability education is also a point that needs to be talked about in Indian context. That how many people, how many children in our country actually need to learn sustainability when the primary concern that they actually have is access to education itself, or for that matter, access to food in that sense. So, a lot of our work, of course, has been on two fronts. One is, of course, working with the high net worth, the carbon net worth individuals that we have in the country, people who actually pollute a lot. And there are lots and lots of people, lots and lots of Indians whose footprint is actually much more than an average European or an average American in that sense. So a lot of our work is actually focused on working with those individuals to look at how do we bring that down. And the other is to also look at the aspirational Indian who wants to live the American way, the Texas way, or the Canadian way, or many other ways that we've been talking about right now, or the IKEA way. Since I'm very, very sure that less than 0.5% of Indian household actually even has a sustainable IKEA furniture in that sense. So we're talking about two lives, two worlds, and that's where a lot of Swechha's work has also been around looking at sustainability from the lens of equity, sustainability where it matters. We're talking about children who consume a lot, which is the rich schools that we're talking about, and children who don't forget about they turning vegan, they crave for a simple egg. So, one of the largest food programs that Indian government actually has in schools is something called midday meal, where they struggle, and the only protein that children actually get is an egg a day. So we talk about two different worlds, two different planets, two different civilizations in that sense in today's conversation, last hour and 15 minutes that we've been talking about. So a lot of Swechha's work is to really bridge that, to talk about these issues and bring in within education. Education sometimes becomes very, very soft a topic, like, conduct a workshop, do a training, let's educate our next generation. But education for the next generation cannot be soft conversation around issues of environment, issues of sustainability. It's very important to talk about issues of equity. Education is a political tool. Education is a political tool for countries like Brazil and India and Mexico, and for that matter, even the first world. And a lot of our work is actually to talk about sustainability from the lens of agency. So 50% of work that Swechha does is to really work on empowering young people and giving them tools and knowledge and skills on conservation and sustainable lifestyle. And 50% of our energy would be for them to ask that question, like what Atsushi was talking about, that this gap that we actually have in terms of what resources are there to change this world. A lot of it is not a child's agency. It's actually the systemic failure that is leading towards unsustainable lifestyle. So, one of the things perhaps when a lot of people have been talking about transition, just transition or general transition, it's not just about transition of energy. We're talking transition of people here. And that is also very, very critical. Like a lot of conversation in recent Glasgow event and otherwise happens around we should stop using coal or we should stop being unsustainable. But the challenge that we actually face on ground when we work in communities, in villages on sustainability is that for them, it's basic survival. So it's lifestyle, but before that, it's life. And there's also livelihood. So there's life, lifestyle, livelihood, and the balance that needs to be done, or perhaps the choices that one has to make is extremely, extremely challenging. So education or sustainability education or the landscape of sustainability in Indian context or third world context is very, very different from consumption that we're talking about. So it's not about plant-based food. It's not about choosing no meat or things. It's just about how do we actually ask an aspirational Indian who really needs at least one electric bulb in his household, at least for 5 hours a day, to choose a better lifestyle. As in, that person anyway his or her footprint is much, much lower than an average Indian's footprint in a sense. And average Indian footprint is 1.9 tons. Of course, America's footprint is 16 tons. America's energy consumption is 12 times more than an average Indian's consumption. I'm not talking about America, but I'm talking about the context in which we need to set this entire idea of sustainability or sustainable education, or for that matter, this entire transition conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Vim. So that link to equity critical. Also, the challenge to the consumer culture is a key piece. And to think about strategies as you're doing, where you're, first of all, also, just like Denise, thinking of the school as a hub of social, cultural, political change, and doing that in two ways, those who don't have enough and those who are living lifestyles that are over-consuming, and of course, how they're related. Could you speak a little bit about the farm school, the sustainability lab that you have, and particularly how it's bringing in a conversation about practices that maybe people have used to think are backward, but are actually perhaps keys to the next piece of our transition?
Sure, Vanessa. So, Vanessa, in India, we don't have repair labs, and it's not a bad thing in the sense our repair culture doesn't happen in cafes. Our repair happens in homes, in neighborhoods, in street side, small little corner. That's what is India. About farm school, when we talk about this new, I will not call it experiment, because experiment is a very, very loose term in that sense when we talk about it. Where we are actually located in a just 100 kilometers outskirts of Delhi, just 50 kilometers from where offices or headquarters of most Fortune 500 countries are, and where we've actually working with a community which is one of the poorest communities of the country, Mewat region, where there are two things that we're trying to do. One is a sustainability lab where people that we've been teaching theory of sustainability, theory of composting, theory of energy conservation, theory of beekeeping, theory of food and agriculture, theory of organic farming, we're actually looking at bringing in these kids of CEOs of Fortune 500 countries, or not just CEOs, but other people, the richies of our country, of North India, to that place, to learn about sustainability. Because unfortunately, when we talk about food, many people in India, and I'm very sure many people in Canada or in Europe, they would not know where does their food come from, who is the producer of their food. And second is that they don't even know whether potato is over a tree or it's under the ground. And if tomato plant is 7 feet or 3 feet, they don't know. They think everything comes from a supermarket. So to bust the supermarket understanding of food, we have a whole curriculum that we've been working on, where we bring in people from cities to a local setting to understand sustainable agriculture, to understand agriculture, to understand food, to understand resources. That's one. Two is that community, this entire school of ours, is actually embedded in one of the poorest districts of India. And these people, they don't have any resource, access to any resource at all. And imagine when we ask people to turn to organic farming. Imagine when there's no access to water, there's no access to food, there's no access to education, there's no access to healthcare. I'm talking about some people on this panel or otherwise of the region called Mewat region. That's where our school is. It gets very, very difficult for us to talk about organic farming or organic food production with the poorest of the poor people.
Right.
So our challenge is that balance that we're looking at. That how do we bring in these communities who otherwise have very, very low carbon footprint and aspiration, and that aspiration is not displeased. What we're asking for is that one fan that they perhaps should have at least 24 hours in 49 degrees centigrade temperature that we have. They're not asked for central cooling or central heating. So that's the difference, and that's where the climate conversation is happening between two sets of people at this farm school. Rich, who consume a lot, poor, who don't have any agency, and they're the ones who have actually been producing food and exporting food to the rest of the world. Imagine India has a lot of food that we produce, but still there are thousands and thousands, I would say millions of people who live below poverty line. And
Great.
that's where perhaps the conversation on climate needs to also shift towards.
Yeah, thank you so much, Vim. Making that connection is so critical, right? Lifestyles, livelihoods, and life. So I think we've got a chance to hear from maybe one or two questions, and for that I'm going to hand it over to Marcus, and then we're going to do one sentence each at the very end from all of our speakers after Joran's had a few reflections, just of something we should keep in mind as we move sustainable lifestyles and education forward. So Marcus, I think maybe let's see if we've got one or two questions.
And I think we have probably time for one
Oh, yes.
quick question.
Yes.
If Carolina's got any
Oh,
up on
and
the
something in
screen.
the room. Let's see if there's, because we have a microphone. Is there one comment or a question from the room somebody might have, just hearing all this? If there's something here, otherwise what we can do is go to Joran for your reflections from what you've heard, and before we do a final round. Okay, over to Joran.
Thank you. I was asked to do a summary. That's not really possible to summarize all the brilliant comments and useful information. But so I'll pick up a few things that I've noted. If I start with what Wim Landa talked about, 2 worlds, 2 lifestyles, and I think that's really important to remember that, and also important to remember that it's not just about differences between countries, but also differences within countries, both differences within richer countries where there are poorer people, and differences within poorer countries where there are also rich people. So I think that's one important part. Another important part was perhaps where we started with the summary of one of the chapters in the IPCC report. I think one of the key conclusions in that chapter is the potential to reduce from demand side reductions to reduce emissions by 40 to 70% in the year 2050. And I think that's an important piece of information from 2 ways. Both that here is an important tool that we must use. Technological changes is not enough. We also need changes in demand side. But also the other way around, demand side changes are not enough. We also need technological development, and I think that's important. Another key issue, I think, is that sustainable consumption isn't really about individual behaviors. It is about changing infrastructure, developing technology, changing norms, keeping in mind the concept where consumption happens. I think that's another important thing, which, if I, in a summary, bring up something we didn't talk about so much, and that's related to public consumption. We talked mostly about private consumption, but public consumption is important because that's, for several reasons. That's an area where governments can have a direct influence through policy changes, but also because public consumptions, generally education and healthcare services, have in general a much lower environmental impact than private consumption. So if we move from our money from private consumption to education and healthcare, which many people are asking for, that will also reduce environmental impacts.
Joran, maybe just one more brilliant summary point or new point.
I was about to end there.
No, did you were about to end there? Oh,
Yeah.
I thought you'd have one more. No, okay. Well, thank you. That was actually a very important point because also public procurement often makes things cheaper and more affordable for private consumers as well. So, Denise, I'll start with you. One sentence or word that you think we should keep in mind as we're thinking about sustainable lifestyles and education moving forward. Denise, what's one word or one sentence? And I'll go to you, Vim. And then
Yeah, sure. And it's a process. We gotta upgrade our game to make a difference.
Great. Thanks, Denise. And over to you, Vim. Word or sentence? Things to keep in mind.
Future, as in, it's very difficult to give this answer in one word. It's future. It's everybody that we talk about. The last person in the line is what you have to think about. Sorry, it wasn't just one word.
Yeah, thank you. Joran, how about yourself?
Urgency, both in both worlds, both in the world where there is not enough food and in the world where we are having a much too large footprint. Urgency.
Great. Dushyant. Oh, yes.
No problem. Well, yep. I will have two words. I'm going to say hope and well-being, because it's, I think what psychology has taught us is that people don't respond to negative information well. They switch to denial, so we need to keep hope. And
Great.
well-being, because that's what we have to create for all of us.
Thanks, Dushyant. Natalie.
Yeah, so just a reflection, I think we need to move away from the narrative that being sustainable is more expensive. There are policies in place, there's subsidies in place that make it cheaper to pollute our planet rather than to restore our planet. And so my personal mission as a climate finance specialist is to make sure that all finance is climate finance, because we need to really, in order to finance the transition, we need to transition finance.
Thanks, Lena.
I think when we talk about sustainable lives and sustainable lifestyles, we need to make sure that they're affordable, they're accessible, and that they're desirable. And then the other word is, of course, collaboration, because it takes something from all of us, from governments to businesses, NGOs, to make it happen, no matter where we are. So I think that collaboration is the other word.
Thank you. Atsushi.
During the past 2-3 decades, we have talked quite a lot about the role of government, role of business, role of educators. But we need to start talking about role of educators with governments, for example, role of finance with communities. So these combinations should be further pursued.
Great. And for me, it's definitely the cultural change part of it. How do we make this the new norm? And last word over to you, Marcus.
And I'll take two. One is that we hear a lot of talk about the need to save the planet. I just want to emphasize it's not the planet we need to save. The planet will do just fine without us. It's us we need to save. The second point is thank you for those of you who joined us in live and virtually, and thank you for your work. Thank you for your work too, otherwise we're all here for the same reason. So thanks for all of that.
Wonderful.